Take a close look at this photograph, because the secret isn't in the center. It's standing at the edge of the frame, in the face of a little girl nobody bothered to understand while she was alive. And what was hidden in her eyes may have survived longer than the names history tried to erase. The image was taken in 1874 somewhere along the Gulf Coast, likely in Louisiana or eastern Texas, though nobody could prove that at first. It showed a black family inside a portrait studio, dressed with the kind of care that tells you this picture mattered to them. The father stood tall in a dark coat. The mother sat with her hands folded, steady and composed. Around them were 5 children, arranged the way studio photographers liked to arrange families back then, balanced, symmetrical, respectable. It looked, at first glance, like 100 other portraits from the Reconstruction era. A family buying itself a place in memory. But there was one child who didn't quite fit. She stood at the far right, a little apart from the others, maybe 7 years old. Her face was turned just slightly, like she moved a second before the shutter closed. That tiny shift changed everything, though nobody knew it at the time, because in that angle, both of her eyes caught the light. And more than a century later, when a historical researcher finally enlarged the image, he saw something that made him stop talking mid-sentence. Her eyes were not the same color. That discovery landed on the desk of Dr. Marcus Bell in the spring of 2026. Marcus worked out of a research office in Atlanta, the kind of place lined with old files, blown-up scans, and framed photographs of strangers whose stories he had spent years trying to return to their descendants. He wasn't a medical doctor. He was a historical genealogist, which basically meant he lived in the narrow space where records, memory, and missing people all meet. The woman who brought him the photograph was named Loretta Hayes, in her late 50s, careful with her words, careful with the cardboard envelope she carried into the room. "My grandmother said we were supposed to keep this," she told him. "Not why, just that we weren't supposed to lose it." Inside the envelope was a cabinet card, about 8 by 10, mounted on thick backing. The edges were browned, the corners had softened with age, but the image itself was remarkably clear. There was no studio stamp on the back, no family name, no town, just a faded handwritten date near the bottom edge. September 3rd, 1874. Marcus started the way he always started. Clothing, backdrop, paper stock, mount board, the boys' collars, the mother's bodice, the painted garden scene behind them. All of it pointed to the mid-1870s, maybe a little earlier, and almost certainly the South. Whoever paid for this sitting had gone to a real photographer, not a traveling amateur, not somebody working with improvised chemistry in a field tent. This was a proper studio, which meant the family had saved money or had enough of it and wanted to be seen in a certain way. Then he lifted his magnifier and reached the youngest girl. He nearly missed it the first time because sepia tones flatten things. They can hide color differences unless the light catches them just right. But once he saw the contrast, he couldn't unsee it. One eye was dark, deep brown or something close to it. The other was much lighter, not white exactly, but grayish, pale enough that it reflected the light differently even in a 19th century photograph. Marcus scanned the image at high resolution, pulled it onto his monitor, and began enhancing only the contrast and detail. Nothing artificial. Nothing changed, just enough to bring out what was already there. The result made it unmistakable. The little girl had heterochromia, one dark eye and one pale blue-gray eye. Loretta stared at the screen from across the desk. "What does that mean?" Marcus didn't answer right away because he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. A trait like that can be random, sure, but it can also be inherited, and when it's inherited, it can function almost like a breadcrumb through time. He pulled up medical references, not because he was trying to diagnose a child from 1874 like some kind of showman, but because physical markers can sometimes tell you what paperwork won't. He found what he suspected, a hereditary condition involving pigmentation, one that can show up as 2 different colored eyes in one person and a white forelock in another. That part mattered, because once he went back through the family photograph looking for related signs, he found them. The older sister seated on the bench had both eyes dark, but near her temple, partly hidden by the way her hair had been arranged, there was a distinct pale patch. Not glare, not damage. Hair. A white streak right at the hairline. And when Marcus pushed the contrast around the mother's face, where the studio lighting had left one side in shadow, he found the faint outline of the same thing at her temple too. So now it wasn't just one child. It was a mother and two daughters carrying different visible expressions of the same inherited trait. That changed the research completely. If this marker passed down directly through that maternal line, then Marcus didn't need a surname first. He needed a record keeper somewhere in the post-war South who had once noticed an unusual eye or a streak of white hair and bothered to write it down. That sounds like a long shot, and it was, but history is full of accidental witnesses. Census takers, labor agents, clergy, ship clerks, doctors. The wrong people wrote the right details all the time. He started with Freedmen's Bureau records from Louisiana, Mississippi, and coastal Alabama. Labor contracts, assistance lists, school rolls, marriage claims. Most were frustrating. Too vague, too broken, too much first-name-only documentation. Then, near midday on the second day, he found a labor contract from 1867 in southern Louisiana. A woman listed simply as Ada, approximate age 36. Next to her name, the bureau clerk had added a note in parentheses. One eye dark, one eye pale. Easy to identify. Marcus just sat there for a second. That was her. Or close enough to be dangerous. The age fit. The region fit. The trait fit exactly. He printed the entry and placed it beside the photograph. If Ada was the mother in the picture, then she was born around 1831. Old enough to have been born enslaved, old enough to have carried children through slavery and into Reconstruction, old enough to have lived long enough to stand in that studio with daughters who had inherited the same trait. But where had Ada come from before Louisiana? That answer was harder. Freedmen's Bureau records only catch people after emancipation, after the rupture, after names have been changed and lives broken apart. To go earlier, Marcus had to enter the ugliest part of the archive, shipping manifests from the domestic slave trade. Lists of human beings treated like freight. Ages, heights, skin, scars, teeth, value. All the ways bureaucracy makes cruelty look normal. He searched manifests from the 1840s and 1850s, moving through New Orleans and Mobile. On the third evening, he found a coastal transport record from 1848. Among those listed was a young woman, about 17, first name Ada. Beside her physical description, the clerk had written two short words, eyes unlike. That was it, just two words. Casual, clinical, enough to identify her in a crowd if she tried to run, and enough to survive almost 180 years until somebody knew what they were looking at. Loretta came back the next morning, and Marcus laid the documents out in order. The family portrait, the labor contract, the shipping record. She listened without interrupting, the way people do when they realize something in their family has been standing in front of them forever, and they just didn't have the language for it. So, her name was Ada. That's the strongest evidence we have so far, Marcus said, and I'm pretty sure she's your line. Loretta looked at the little girl in the photograph for a long time. Then she asked the question he'd been asking himself. Where was Ada from before all this? That answer wasn't sitting in any one document. It had to be built. Marcus reached out to a population genetics lab he'd worked with before, one that studied inherited pigmentation variants in African diaspora communities. He also asked Loretta to submit a full maternal line DNA sequence through the research lab. Not a consumer kit, something deeper. The trait in the photograph suggested a very specific path. If the mitochondrial line and the documented mutation lined up, they might be able to narrow geography in a meaningful way. The results took 10 days. When Dr. Naomi Clark from the lab called, she didn't waste time. The maternal haplogroup clusters in a narrow corridor of Upper Guinea, and the variant associated with the pigmentation trait in your case appears in published data from one main population group. Which group? The Temne. Marcus knew the name immediately, Northern Sierra Leone. a people heavily targeted during the late legal and illegal phases of the transatlantic slave trade. Not proof by itself, but combined with the photograph, the inherited marker, and the maternal line, it was strong. Strong enough to change the question from who were they to how far back can we hear them. That answer came from a letter, not to Loretta, not to Marcus, just a letter in an archive in New Orleans, donated decades ago with a bundle of miscellaneous family papers that no one had properly connected to anything. It was dated 1889 and written by a woman who said only that she had once been called another name before she was given the name Ada. The English was careful, deliberate, clearly learned later in life. She described being taken from a village near a river. She described a mother with one dark eye and one pale eye. She described being told as a child that the eyes in their family meant they belonged to a certain people and a certain place, and that even if everything else was stripped away, the sign would remain. When Marcus read that line, he went silent, because suddenly the little girl in the photograph was not just carrying a strange visual trait. She was carrying a map written into her body, passed from mother to daughter across ocean crossings, auctions, forced labor, renamed births, missing records, and the deliberate destruction of black family history. Marcus cross-checked the river description in the letter against 19th century maps of Sierra Leone and coastal trade routes. The geography pointed again and again to one region, a river corridor in Temne territory, the same area the DNA data suggested. The same area consistent with late 18th and early 19th century slave trading capture zones. When Loretta returned for the final meeting, Marcus spread everything across the desk in a kind of staircase through time. The 1874 studio portrait, the 1867 labor contract, the 1848 shipping manifest, the lab report, the map, the letter. Each one by itself would have been suggestive. Together they became something much bigger. A family whose names had been scraped away from the photograph now had a mother line reaching back to Sierra Leone. Not perfectly, not with every gap closed. History rarely gives you that. But enough. More than enough. Loretta picked up the printed copy of the old letter and read the line about the eyes twice. She remembered, she said quietly. Yes. She wrote it down so somebody would know. Yes. Then she looked at the photograph again, at the little girl standing at the edge, one pale eye catching the studio light. A child in 1874 who had no way of knowing that the thing making her different would one day guide her descendants back toward a place history had tried to bury. She didn't know what she was carrying, Loretta said. No, Marcus said, but her grandmother did. That, I think, is the part that gets me most. We talk about history like it only lives in paper. Ledgers, records, government files, newspaper clippings, but paper burns. Names get altered, children get renamed, mothers disappear into somebody else's household count, whole bloodlines get swallowed by the language of property, then poverty, then silence. And still sometimes, something survives outside the archive. In the body, in an eye, in a streak of hair, in a trait no one can confiscate. That little girl in the photograph did not know she was standing there with a clue in her face. She was just a child, holding still because the photographer told her to. But the camera caught what history had missed. And 152 years later, someone finally knew how to read it. Loretta left, with the photograph in the same envelope it had lived in for generations, but it was not the same object anymore. Before, it had been important for reasons no one could explain. Now it had shape, weight, a name, a route, a river, not the full original name Ada had once carried. That may still be waiting, but now Loretta knew where to look, and that matters, because history forgets all the time, on purpose sometimes, out of laziness other times. But DNA doesn't forget. It waits, quietly, patiently. And every once in a while, if somebody looks closely enough, it answers.